It made no sense at all that the only person not stealing anything in the entire luxury mall was the one being followed like a suspect, and yet every polished marble step Danielle Brooks took echoed with a second set of footsteps just a little too close, just a little too intentional, like a shadow that had decided it no longer needed permission to exist. The mall itself was quiet in that expensive way, the kind of quiet that came with $12 bottled water and storefronts glowing under soft white lighting, where people didn't rush, they drifted, and every display whispered price tags without showing them, but the illusion cracked the moment a voice cut across the air sharp and certain, "Ma'am, we've been watching you," and just like that, heads turned, conversations paused, and Danielle stopped, not because she was startled, but because she had heard that exact tone before, not yesterday, not last week, but years ago, layered across time like a script no one had bothered to rewrite. She turned slowly, not defensive, not confused, just present, her expression calm in a way that didn't match the accusation hanging in the air, her outfit simple, dark jeans, a neutral top, no visible logos, no signals for the kind of money that usually moved comfortably through spaces like this, and that was the problem, because in a place designed to measure worth at a glance, she didn't fit the visual equation, and the man standing behind her in a tailored security uniform made that clear without needing to say another word, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed, not scanning but targeting, as if the decision had already been made long before she ever stepped through the glass doors. Somewhere to the left, a sales associate leaned toward another and whispered something just quiet enough to be deniable but loud enough to spread, and within seconds the atmosphere shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Danielle didn't argue, didn't ask why, didn't reach for proof or raise her voice. She simply looked at him for a moment longer than most people would, long enough to make the silence uncomfortable, then asked, evenly, "Watching me for what?" And the question didn't escalate the moment, it exposed it, because the answer didn't come right away, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where certainty should have lived but didn't, was the first crack in something much larger than a misunderstanding. Behind them, a couple paused mid-step, a teenager lifted her phone without thinking, and a store manager just inside the nearest boutique shifted his stance as if deciding whether to step in or step back, because situations like this didn't just belong to one person, they spread, they pulled people in, they forced choices, and the mall that had felt controlled just moments ago now felt like it was waiting for something to happen. Danielle adjusted the strap of her bag slightly, not nervously, just deliberately, as if reminding herself of something no one else in that space could see, and when the security guard finally spoke again, repeating that she needed to leave, his voice firmer now, louder, meant to carry, she didn't move, not forward, not back, just still, grounded in a way that made his authority feel suddenly smaller than it had a moment ago, and that was when the real tension began, not in the accusation, not in the watching, but in the quiet realization spreading through the room that whatever this was, it wasn't going to end the way it started. The hesitation did not last long, but it lasted long enough to change everything, because once authority pauses in front of witnesses it no longer feels absolute, and the guard seemed to realize that too, shifting his weight slightly as if trying to recover control that had already started to slip. "I am asking you to leave," he said finally, choosing the safer answer. The one that sounded less like an accusation and more like a suggestion, but the problem with that choice was that it removed the urgency, and without urgency the entire scene began to look exactly like what it was, a judgment made too quickly and now struggling to justify itself. Danielle Brooks gave a small nod, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, as if she had just been handed the piece of information she needed, and for a brief moment it seemed like she might actually comply. Like she might turn and walk toward the exit and allow the story to end quietly the way these moments often did, but she did not move. Not yet, because leaving would resolve the situation for them, not for her, and resolution built on assumption was not something she had ever accepted. Inside the nearby boutique, the manager who had been hovering stepped forward more confidently now, sensing that the situation required reinforcement. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided there was, and his eyes did not meet Danielle's first. They went to the guard, then to the small gathering forming behind them, measuring the audience before acknowledging the person at the center of it, and when he finally looked at her, it was quick, assessing, dismissive in a way that did not need words to be understood. "We have received concerns," the guard added, attempting to strengthen the narrative, and that word, concerns, floated awkwardly in the air because no one had actually voiced one out loud, not clearly, not directly, and now the lack of specificity began to echo louder than any accusation could have. A woman standing a few feet away crossed her arms and said quietly but clearly, "What concerns?" And just like that, the question that Danielle had asked earlier found a second voice, and then a third when someone else murmured, "She has not done anything," and the balance shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to make the manager's posture tighten, because situations like this depended on silent agreement, and once that silence broke, control became harder to maintain. Above them, in the control room, the second guard leaned closer to the monitor, watching the crowd form in small increments. "It is getting attention," he said into the headset, and the response came quickly, "Then resolve it." But resolution was no longer simple, not with cameras raised and questions being asked in real time. Danielle glanced briefly toward the boutique, toward the employees pretending to organize displays while clearly watching, and then back to the guard, her voice still calm, still measured. "You followed me through 3 different stores," she said, not accusing, just stating, and the accuracy of that statement landed heavier than any protest could have, because it revealed intent, not just reaction, and the guard did not deny it. He could not with the cameras, not with the witnesses, not with the pattern already visible. A quiet ripple moved through the small crowd, the kind that came from recognition, from connecting pieces that had been scattered just moments before. And suddenly this was not just about one interaction, it was about a sequence, a decision made early and carried forward without question, and Danielle stood at the center of it all, not louder than anyone else, not more aggressive, just more precise, and in that precision the entire structure of the moment began to feel unstable, like something built on assumption that could no longer support its own weight. The word sequence hung in the air longer than anyone expected, because once a pattern is named it becomes impossible to ignore, and the manager's confidence, which had entered the moment so smoothly, now carried a faint edge of strain as he adjusted his stance and tried to reclaim control with something that sounded official. "We have protocols in place to protect our stores," he said, projecting his voice just enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, but the statement did not land the way he intended, because it did not answer the question, it only dressed it differently, and Danielle Brooks caught that immediately, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already heard every version of that sentence before and knew exactly where it led. "Protocols do not follow someone across 3 locations without cause," she replied, not louder than him, not sharper, just clearer. And clarity in that moment carried more weight than volume ever could, because it forced the room to confront the difference between policy and perception, and the two were no longer aligning. The guard shifted again, his earlier certainty now replaced with something more cautious, more aware of the eyes around him, because the teenager's phone was no longer the only one recording. Others had quietly joined in, holding their devices at chest level, pretending not to be involved while capturing everything. And that silent documentation changed the atmosphere in a way no announcement could. Reverse, inside the boutique, one of the younger employees hesitated near the entrance, glancing between the manager and Danielle, then finally stepping forward just enough to be heard. "She has not touched anything," he said, his voice unsure but present, and that small statement, simple as it was, carried a different kind of authority, not official but honest. And honesty in a moment built on assumption began to unravel the structure piece by piece. The manager's jaw tightened slightly, not visibly enough to call out but enough to signal pressure building beneath the surface, and he responded quickly. Almost too quickly. "That is not the point," but the problem was that it had become the point, because without an action there was nothing to justify the response, and without justification the entire situation began to feel exposed. Above them, the control room monitor displayed the growing cluster of people, and the voice on the headset came through again, sharper this time. "Why is this not resolved?" But resolution required certainty, and certainty was no longer available. Danielle glanced briefly at the reflections in the glass storefronts around her, not checking her appearance but observing the scene as a whole, the positioning of people, the direction of attention, the way authority was being tested without anyone raising their voice, and then she looked back at the manager and asked, "What exactly triggered your concern?" And the question did not accuse, it demanded definition. And definition was exactly what they did not have. A silence followed, not empty but full, filled With expectation, with cameras, with witnesses who had now shifted from passive observers to active participants simply by paying attention, and in that silence the manager realized that repeating policy would not be enough, that authority without explanation would not hold, and that whatever answer he gave next would not just affect Danielle, it would define him in front of everyone watching. For a brief second he considered stepping back, de-escalating, reframing the moment as a misunderstanding, but the presence of the crowd made retreat feel like admission, and so he held his ground, even as the ground beneath him began to feel less stable with every passing second, while Danielle remained exactly where she was, calm, precise, and completely unwilling to let the moment be reduced to anything less than the truth it was slowly revealing. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, and in that discomfort something shifted again, not loudly but unmistakably, as if the entire mall had begun to lean in closer, waiting for the answer that still had not come, and the manager, now fully aware that repeating vague language would only deepen the problem, chose a different approach, one that sounded more direct but carried an even sharper edge. "You fit a pattern we are trained to watch," he said, and the moment those words left his mouth, the air changed, because this time there was no abstraction, no policy to hide behind, just a statement that revealed more than it protected. A low murmur moved through the small crowd, not chaotic but focused, the kind of sound people make when something they suspected is suddenly confirmed, and Danielle Brooks did not interrupt him, did not react immediately. She simply held his gaze for a second longer than before, letting the weight of his own words settle around him. Because sometimes the most powerful response is allowing someone to fully hear what they have just said. "A pattern," she repeated, her tone even, her expression unchanged, but there was a precision in the way she said it now, as if she were isolating the exact point where assumption had replaced fact, and the manager nodded once, quickly, as if doubling down would restore control. "Yes, suspicious movement, repeated passes, no purchases," he added, listing observations that sounded structured but felt incomplete the moment they were spoken aloud, because everyone listening could sense what was missing, the part he did not say, the part that had nothing to do with movement and everything to do with perception. Danielle glanced briefly around the space again, not searching, just acknowledging the people now openly watching, the phones raised, the employees no longer pretending to be occupied, and then she asked quietly, "So walking through a mall without buying something makes someone suspicious?" And the simplicity of the question landed harder than any accusation, because it stripped the situation down to its most basic form, exposing how little it actually took for the entire sequence to begin. The guard shifted again, his posture less rigid now, his certainty thinning under the growing attention, and for the first time he looked not just at Danielle but at the crowd, at the witnesses who were no longer silent, and that glance revealed something important. This was no longer contained, no longer controlled. Inside the boutique, the younger employee who had spoken earlier took another small step forward, his voice steadier this time. "People walk in and out all day without buying anything," he said, and no one corrected him, no one contradicted him, because it was true, and truth in that moment felt louder than authority. Above them, in the control room, one of the guards exhaled slowly, watching the situation unravel in real time. "This is not going the way it should," he muttered, but there was no easy correction anymore, no reset button for a moment that had already exposed too much. Danielle's expression remained calm, but there was a subtle shift now, not in emotion but in intention, as if she had reached the point where observation was no longer enough, and she adjusted her stance slightly, grounding herself in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, and final. Because the line between being watched and being judged had already been crossed, and now something else was about to begin. Something that would not rely on their assumptions, their protocols, or their version of the story, but on something far more precise, far more structured, and far beyond their control. Something had shifted in Danielle Brooks long before anyone else noticed it, not in her posture or her expression, but in the way she stopped reacting entirely, because there is a moment in every situation like this where explanation becomes pointless and observation turns into decision, and she had reached that moment now. The manager was still speaking, still trying to reinforce his position with words that sounded structured but no longer held weight. "We are trained to identify risks," he added, as if repeating the idea would make it more valid, but the crowd was no longer listening the same way, because once people begin to question the foundation of a claim, every additional statement starts to feel like an attempt to cover it rather than support it. A man standing near the edge of the gathering shook his head slightly and said under his breath, "This is not about risk," and someone beside him nodded without looking away. And that quiet agreement spread faster than any instruction from the manager could contain. Danielle's gaze moved once more across the space, not searching for support, but acknowledging the shift, the subtle alignment of people who had not planned to be involved but now found themselves unwilling to ignore what they were seeing, and then she reached into her bag, not hurried, not defensive, just deliberate, and that single movement drew every eye back to her, because it signaled change. Not escalation, but transition. The guard straightened. Instinctively, his attention sharpening, while the manager's voice paused mid-sentence, uncertainty flickering for the first time in a way that could not be hidden, because whatever they expected next, it was not this level of calm. Danielle pulled out her phone, held it for a brief second as if confirming something internally, and then tapped the screen with a precision that suggested this was not a reaction but a step already decided long before she entered the building. Above them, in the control room, one of the guards leaned closer, watching the monitor intently. "She is calling someone," he said, and the response came quickly, "Then end it now." But ending it was no longer within their control, not in the way they thought. Back on the floor, the teenager with the phone whispered, "This is about to change," and even though she did not know how, she felt it, the same way others did, that quiet sense that the direction of the moment had already turned and was simply waiting to be revealed. Danielle lifted the phone to her ear, her voice low but clear enough for those closest to hear. "This is Danielle," she said, not explaining, not introducing, just stating. And there was a pause on the other end, followed by a response that no one else could hear, but whatever was said caused the slightest shift in her expression, not emotion, but confirmation. "Activate retail protocol," she continued, her tone steady, measured, full property. Level 3 audit, and the words themselves did not mean much to most of the people standing there, but the certainty behind them did, because it was not the language of someone defending herself, it was the language of someone initiating something far larger than the moment in front of them. The manager blinked, the confidence he had been holding on to beginning to fracture in real time. Because there was no version of protocol he recognized that started this way, no script that prepared him for a response that did not argue, did not resist, but instead escalated in a direction he could not follow, and for the first time since this began, he looked at Danielle not as a problem to manage, but as something he did not fully understand, and that realization, quiet as it was, marked the exact point where control slipped from his hands and into hers. The words did not echo loudly, but they carried in a way that made the entire space feel different, because Level 3 audit was not the kind of phrase people used casually, and even those who did not understand it could feel that it meant something structured, something official, something irreversible once set in motion. For a brief moment nothing happened, at least not visibly, and that silence stretched across the polished floors like a held breath, but then it began, subtle at first, almost invisible, a shift in the environment that did not announce itself but revealed itself piece by piece. Inside the boutique, the manager's tablet buzzed softly in his hand, a notification he did not expect, and his eyes dropped to the screen for just a second before lifting again, confusion flickering across his face as he read a message that did not match the situation he thought he was controlling. Across the corridor, another store employee glanced down at a handheld device and frowned, tapping the screen as if trying to refresh something that should not have changed, and above them, in the control room, one of the guards leaned forward sharply as multiple alerts appeared across the system interface, red flags replacing the steady green indicators that had been there moments before. "We are getting system pings across retail," he said, his voice tighter now, less certain, and the response on the headset came slower this time, less confident. From where? But there was no clear answer, because the origin was not inside the mall's internal structure, it was external, layered above it, connected to something they did not have visibility into. Back on the floor, the manager stepped back half a pace without realizing it, his attention split between Danielle Brooks and the screen in his hand, the certainty he had been holding on to now slipping through his fingers as the information in front of him refused to align with his assumptions. "What did you just do?" he asked, and for the first time his voice did not carry authority, it carried uncertainty, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer the highest point in the chain. Danielle did not answer immediately. She did not need to, because the environment was already responding for her, the small, controlled systems that governed each store beginning to react to something larger, something coordinated, something precise. The teenager recording whispered again, "Something is happening," and this time no one dismissed it, because they could see it, the subtle disruption moving from one storefront to another, not chaotic, not loud, but undeniable. The guard glanced toward the manager, then back at Danielle, and for the first time since this began, he did not step closer, he did not repeat his instruction, he simply watched, because instinct told him that whatever this was, it was no longer a situation he could resolve with proximity or presence. Danielle's phone lowered slowly from her ear, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that no longer read as passive but as controlled, deliberate, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly through the space. "You said you follow patterns," she said, her eyes moving briefly between the manager and the guard. "So do I," and the difference between those two statements, subtle as it seemed, landed with a weight that no one in that moment could ignore, because one had been based on assumption, and the other was now unfolding as reality. For a moment it felt like time slowed down, not because everything stopped, but because everything became clearer, sharper, like the noise had been stripped away and only the truth of the moment remained, and in that clarity Danielle Brooks did not see a mall or a crowd or even the people standing in front of her. She saw a pattern she had known her entire life, one that had followed her long before any security guard ever did. She was 16 again, standing in a store not unlike this one. Smaller, less polished, but carrying the same quiet judgment in the air, holding a sweater she could afford but was never allowed to belong to, and the clerk had watched her the same way, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented in their mind, and when they asked her to leave back then, they had not shouted, they had smiled, they had used polite words to cover an impolite truth, and she had left. Because at 16 you do not yet understand that silence does not protect you, it teaches them that they were right. The memory did not hurt the way it used to, it did not rise with emotion or anger, it settled, steady and cold, like something refined over time into clarity, and when she looked back at the present, at the manager now checking his device again, at the guard no longer certain where to stand, at the crowd that had grown from a handful of observers into something that felt like accountability, she understood exactly what this moment was, not an incident, not a misunderstanding, but a continuation, a system repeating itself because no one had ever forced it to stop. The alerts continued to move quietly through the environment, not disruptive enough to cause panic, but consistent enough to be undeniable. Each store reacting in small ways, systems refreshing, access points shifting, internal processes waking up as if something long dormant had been triggered all at once, and above them the control room was no longer calm, voices overlapping, screens filling with indicators that did not align with normal operations. "This is external authorization," one voice said, and another answered, "From who?" But the question had no immediate answer, only growing urgency. Back on the floor, the manager took another step back, this time intentionally, his eyes moving between Danielle and the surrounding stores, as if trying to connect pieces that no longer fit the narrative he had built. "You need to stop whatever this is," he said, but the request sounded smaller than the moment, smaller than the system already in motion, and Danielle's gaze held steady, not dismissive, not aggressive, just certain, the kind of certainty that comes from understanding something at a level others have not yet reached. The teenager recording lowered her phone slightly, not because she lost interest, but because she realized she was no longer just capturing a moment, she was witnessing a shift, something larger than a single interaction, something that would not reset once it ended, and around her others felt it too, the quiet realization that what they were seeing was not just someone being challenged, it was the challenge itself being dismantled in real time. Danielle took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the transition fully, because the past had already informed the present, and the present was now reshaping something much bigger, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of both, calm but unmistakable. "This is what happens," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the space before returning to the manager, "when you confuse presence with permission," and in that moment, no one needed further explanation, because the system they trusted had already begun to answer for itself. The moment did not explode, it unfolded, and that difference was what made it impossible to ignore, because nothing Danielle Brooks had done looked dramatic, nothing felt exaggerated, yet everything around her was changing in ways no one could stop, and the system, the invisible structure that had once supported the confidence of the manager and the certainty of the guard, was now responding to something far beyond their reach. The manager's device buzzed again, louder this time, persistent. And when he looked down his expression shifted completely, not confusion anymore but recognition, the kind that comes too late, his eyes scanning the message as if hoping it would change if he read it twice. Compliance review initiated, it read, followed by a string of internal codes he had only seen during scheduled audits. Never like this, never unannounced, never live. Across the corridor another store manager stepped out of their location, holding a tablet with the same alert, their eyes searching the space until they landed on the small gathering forming around Danielle, and in that instant the connection began to spread, not verbally, but visually, one look passing to another, a realization moving faster than any explanation. Above them, in the control room, the monitors were no longer stable, alerts stacking over each other, access logs refreshing, permissions shifting in real time. "We are locked out of retail oversight," one of the guards said, his voice tight, almost disbelieving, and the response came quickly, sharper now, "Who has override?" But no one answered, because the answer was already visible on the screen, an external authorization code stamped across multiple systems at once, not forced, not hacked, but granted, deliberately, officially. Back on the floor, the guard took a small step back, not instructed, not commanded, just instinct, because whatever authority he thought he had was no longer aligned with the reality unfolding in front of him, and for the first time since he approached Danielle, he did not speak, did not repeat his request. He simply watched, his role reduced to observer. The crowd had grown, not dramatically, but enough to form a quiet perimeter, people no longer passing through, no longer pretending not to see, their attention fixed on the center where the balance of power had already shifted without announcement. Danielle stood exactly where she had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone, but everything around her now moved in response to something she had set in motion, and when the manager finally looked back up at her, the question in his eyes was no longer what she had done, it was who she was. "You cannot do this," he said, but the statement lacked force, lacked certainty, because the evidence around him contradicted it in real time, and Danielle's response came without hesitation, not louder, not sharper, just final. "It is already done," she said, and the simplicity of those words carried more weight than anything else in that moment, because they were not a threat, not a warning, they were a fact, one that the system itself was now confirming with every alert, every locked process, every message appearing across devices. Somewhere behind the crowd, someone whispered, "She controls this," and no one corrected them, because it was becoming clear that control had never been where they thought it was, and the pattern they believed they were following had just led them directly into something far more precise, far more structured, and far more powerful than they had ever considered. The denial came too late to carry any weight, and everyone in the space felt it, because reality had already moved past permission, past objection, into something structured and irreversible, and the manager knew it the moment his device buzzed again, not once but repeatedly, each notification stacking over the last like a countdown he could not stop, and when he looked down this time his face did not just change, it fell, the confidence that had once defined his posture now replaced with something far more fragile, something exposed. Across the corridor, multiple storefronts began receiving the same alert, identical language, identical codes, each one confirming what was already unfolding. Compliance review, immediate, full scope, no delay, and the employees inside those stores did not need explanation. They recognized the format, the authority behind it, the absence of negotiation. Above them, the control room was no longer attempting to understand what was happening, it was reacting, voices overlapping, systems refreshing faster than they could track. "We have lost access to override channels," one voice said, sharper now, edged with urgency, and another followed, "Corporate authorization is above us," and that phrase, simple as it was, explained everything and nothing at the same time, because it meant the decision was not just made, it was sanctioned at a level none of them could reach. Back on the floor, the guard lowered his stance slightly, not dramatically, but enough to signal the shift, his role no longer active, no longer directive, just present, watching something unfold that he could not influence, and for the first time since this began, he avoided direct eye contact with Danielle Brooks, because whatever assumption had guided him before had already been replaced by something far more certain, far more real. The crowd had grown quieter, not less engaged, but more focused. The kind of silence that comes when people realize they are witnessing something definitive, something that will not be undone once it finishes, and within that silence Danielle remained exactly as she had been from the start, calm, measured, unchanged, the only constant in a space that was now shifting around her. The manager looked up again, but this time there was no authority in his expression, only realization. Slow and unavoidable, his voice lower now, almost searching. "Who are you?" he asked, and the question did not challenge her, it revealed him, because it confirmed what everyone was beginning to understand, that the entire situation had been built on not knowing, on assuming, on deciding before asking. Danielle let the question sit for a moment, not to create tension, but because the answer did not need urgency, it needed clarity, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision it had held from the beginning. "I do not shop here," she said, her eyes steady, her tone even, and the crowd leaned in slightly, not physically but in attention, because they could feel what was coming next. "I audit the firm that governs every retail operation in this building," she continued, and the words did not rise, did not echo, but they landed with a weight that shifted the entire space, because in that single sentence the hierarchy they thought they understood rearranged itself completely. The manager's grip on his device loosened slightly, not dropping it, but no longer holding it as something that gave him control, and the guard stepped back fully now, not instructed, not forced, just aligned with the reality that had already taken shape, and somewhere within the crowd, a voice barely above a whisper said, she was never the one being watched, and no one corrected it, because by now it was clear, she had been the one watching all along, measuring, observing, and when the moment came, acting with a precision that did not need volume, did not need force, only truth backed by structure, and that truth had just rewritten everything they thought they knew. The words did not echo, but they settled into the space with a finality that no one could ignore, because once Danielle Brooks spoke them, everything that had happened before rearranged itself instantly, every assumption collapsing under the weight of a reality that had been there the entire time, just unseen. The manager did not respond right away, not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left that would hold. His earlier confidence now replaced with a silence that felt heavier than any argument he could have made, and his eyes moved again to his device, as if hoping the alerts would stop, as if the system might correct itself, but it did not. It continued, steady, precise, each notification confirming that the process was not only active, but expanding. Across the corridor, more employees stepped out of their stores, drawn by the same messages, the same confusion. Their attention pulled toward the center where Danielle stood, and one by one they began to understand, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that this was no longer a situation they could ignore or dismiss. Above them, in the control room, the tone had shifted completely, no longer questioning but reacting. "Corporate has locked priority access," one voice said, and another followed, quieter, more measured. "We are not in control anymore," and that realization, spoken out loud, marked the end of any illusion they had been holding on to. Back on the floor, the guard took another step back, not dramatic, not forced, just natural, as if his position had been recalibrated without instruction, and his presence, once central, now felt peripheral, like someone watching something unfold rather than directing it. The crowd remained still, but the energy had changed, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but aware, fully aware that what they were witnessing was not just a confrontation. It was a correction, something precise and structured unfolding in real time. The manager finally looked up again, but this time there was no challenge in his expression, only the slow realization of consequence. "This is going to shut everything down," he said, and his voice carried something new now. Not authority, not control, but concern, because he could see it, the ripple effect moving outward, touching systems he depended on, processes he understood, all responding to something he could not stop. Danielle's gaze remained steady, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, her tone did not rise, did not sharpen, it stayed exactly where it had been from the beginning, controlled, deliberate. "It is already reviewing everything," she said, and the distinction mattered, because this was not destruction, not chaos, it was examination, structured, methodical, the kind that revealed more than it removed. A store employee a few steps away whispered to another, "This is a full audit," and the words spread quickly, because they made sense of what people were seeing, the alerts, the system changes, the sudden shift in control, and with that understanding came something else, accountability. The quiet recognition that whatever had happened here would not end here, it would be documented. Analyzed, carried forward beyond this moment, the manager's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, the kind that comes when someone realizes that the situation is no longer theirs to manage, and the guard, now fully still, no longer spoke at all, because there was nothing left to enforce, nothing left to instruct, only something to witness. Danielle stood at the center of it all, not elevated, not dramatic, just present, the same way she had been from the beginning, but now the space around her reflected something different, not suspicion, not judgment, but clarity, the kind that comes when assumptions are replaced with truth, and as the systems continue to respond quietly in the background, one thing became undeniable to everyone watching. This moment had never been about her belonging in that space, it had been about whether that space could withstand being seen for what it truly was. And now it was. The structure did not collapse all at once, it unraveled with precision, step by step, each system response exposing another layer that had been hidden beneath routine and assumption, and the people who worked within it could feel that shift more clearly than anyone else, because for them this was not abstract, it was operational, it was real. The manager's device buzzed again, but this time he did not check it immediately. He already knew what it would say, and when he finally looked, the message confirmed what he had begun to accept: access privileges suspended pending review, effective immediately, and beneath that a directive he had never seen applied in real time: management activity under compliance observation. Across the corridor, similar reactions played out in quiet synchronization, employees reading alerts with widening eyes, supervisors stepping aside to make calls that were not being answered the way they expected, their usual channels no longer responding with reassurance but with instruction, clear, concise, and final. Above them, the control room had shifted from confusion to containment, the voices no longer overlapping but controlled, deliberate. All retail zones flagged for audit compliance, one voice stated, and another followed, maintain observation only, and that phrase carried weight, because it meant there was nothing left to control, only something to document. Back on the floor, the guard stood still, his presence no longer directive but reflective, as if he too had become part of the scene rather than its authority, and the distance between him and Danielle Brooks now felt symbolic, not just physical, a line that had been redrawn without confrontation, without resistance, simply by truth asserting itself through structure. The crowd remained, but their energy had changed again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but settled, aware that what they had witnessed was not an argument resolved but a system corrected, and within that awareness came something quieter: respect, not for what Danielle had done in the moment, but for how she had done it, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, only allowing the truth to surface through action. The manager finally lowered his device completely, his shoulders no longer rigid, his stance no longer defensive, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the authority it once had, only acknowledgement. This will be reviewed at every level, he said, and though it sounded like a statement, it felt more like a realization, one that had come too late to change anything. Danielle's expression remained unchanged, her presence steady, and when she responded, her tone matched the moment perfectly, calm, controlled, but final. It already is, she said, and the distinction mattered, because there was no delay, no future tense. This was happening now, in real time, across systems that extended far beyond this building. A store employee near the edge of the crowd exhaled slowly, almost as if releasing something they had been holding without realizing it, and another beside them nodded slightly, not speaking, but understanding, because what had unfolded here was not unfamiliar, it was just rarely seen to its conclusion. Danielle glanced once more around the space, not to measure, not to assess, but to acknowledge the people, the environment, the shift that had taken place, and then she turned slightly, her movement smooth, unhurried, signaling not an escape, but a conclusion, because for her the moment had already ended the second. The system responded. Behind her, the alerts continued, steady, methodical, documenting everything that had led to this point, ensuring that it would not be dismissed, not be forgotten, and as she began to walk, the space did not return to what it had been. It could not, because once something has been seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and in that quiet, undeniable truth, the entire structure had already begun to change. Danielle Brooks did not rush as she walked, and that was the final detail that stayed with everyone watching, because there was no urgency in her movement, no need to escape or prove anything further, just a quiet certainty that what needed to happen had already been set in motion, and the mall, once filled with soft music and controlled elegance, now carried something else beneath it, something heavier, something real, behind her. The systems continued their work, not loudly, not disruptively, but with a steady precision that no one could ignore, each store now part of a process larger than itself, each decision logged, each action reviewed, and for the employees standing there, this was no longer theoretical, it was personal, it was their environment being measured against a standard that did not bend to assumption. The manager remained where he was, no longer issuing instructions, no longer attempting to regain control, his earlier authority replaced by stillness, the kind that comes when someone understands that the moment has already passed them by, and the consequences are no longer in their hands. While the guard stood a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid, his role no longer defined by enforcement, but by reflection, as if he too was replaying the sequence in his mind, step by step, seeing it now not as it felt in the moment, but as it truly was. The crowd began to shift slowly, not dispersing in confusion, but easing back into motion with a new awareness, conversations starting quietly, not loud or chaotic, but thoughtful, the kind that carry forward long after the moment itself has ended, because what they had witnessed was not just an incident, it was a correction, something precise and undeniable. One of the store employees near the entrance looked down at his device again, then back at the space Danielle had just walked through, and shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in understanding, because the pattern had been there all along, and now it had been seen clearly. Above them, the control room screen stabilized, not because the system had returned to normal, but because a new process had taken over, structured, monitored, beyond their immediate reach, and the voices inside no longer questioned what was happening. They documented it, knowing that this moment would not disappear once it ended, it would be reviewed, analyzed, remembered. Danielle reached the edge of the corridor and paused. For just a second, not turning back fully, but enough to let her voice carry one last time, calm, steady, unmistakable. "You did not follow risk," she said, her words cutting clean through the quiet space. "You followed assumption," and she let that settle, not forcing it, not repeating it, because it did not need emphasis, it already held its weight. She continued without raising her tone. "An assumption always reveals more about the system than the person you place it on," and with that, she turned and kept walking, her steps measured, her presence unchanged, leaving behind a space that could no longer return to what it had been. The mall did not stop, the lights did not dim, the doors did not close, but something fundamental had shifted, something that would not reset overnight, because the truth had been seen not through argument or confrontation, but through structure, through action, through a system forced to examine itself in real time, and as the quiet hum of operations continued beneath the surface, one thing remained certain for everyone who had been there. This was never about whether she belonged in that space, it was about whether that space could withstand the truth of how it decided who did, and now that truth was no longer hidden.